Welcome to End of Life University on YouTube. Today I'm sharing with you an audio recording of a conversation I had with Elizabeth Coplan, and we talk about grief dialogues for women who are motherless daughters. And Elizabeth has recorded these conversations, and I think you'll really enjoy listening to her insights about grief for motherless daughters. So stay tuned for that. Be sure and subscribe down below to this channel. Also, subscribe and leave a rating and review for the podcast wherever you happen to listen to End of Life University. And if you're interested and willing to give a little support to keep this show on the air, go to eoluniversity.com/support. So we'll move on with my conversation with Elizabeth Coplan. Hello, everyone, and welcome to End of Life University podcast, where we share real talk about life and death. I'm your host, Dr. Karen Wyatt, as usual. Thanks for joining me here for episode number 246. If you're listening in real time, you'll know that this episode is actually being broadcast one day early on Mother's Day. And I'll be talking with Elizabeth Coplan in just a moment about Mother's Day grief dialogues for motherless daughters. So I want to take a moment just to wish a very happy Mother's Day to every mother out there who might be listening. Know that you are loved and so appreciated, and that your work and your efforts to raise beautiful, strong, loving children makes all the difference in our world. And so I do hope that you are having a wonderful day today and a beautiful celebration, though I know that many of us, most of us, are probably not able to be together with our mothers on this day. So mothers are not able to celebrate with their children, and yes, unless they're young enough to be at home. And so even across the distance, I hope that we can all share and experience the love we have for our mothers, for our children, from our children. And so before we get into today's interview, I just have one announcement, which is that my book, 7 Lessons for Living from the Dying, is now, or almost now, released and available for purchase on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Google Books. It's being published right now as an ebook, but will be available as soon as possible in print form whenever the printing and distribution companies are up and running again. So you can go to 7lessonsbook.com, and that's 7, the number 7, not the word 7, 7lessonsbook.com. If you'd like to read more about it and see some of the endorsements that the book has gathered so far. And you can also just go to the show notes for this episode, eolupodcast.com, episode number 246, and you'll see some information and a link to purchase the book right there. I hope you'll buy it as an ebook. It's fairly inexpensive. The publisher, thankfully, made it inexpensive so people can start out with the ebook, and you can go back and purchase the print book later if you decide you'd like to have a hard copy. So we'll get on now with my interview for Mother's Day grief dialogues for motherless daughters. And as always, stay tuned after this interview, and I'll be back with a few takeaways and to say goodbye. So here we go. Today, I'm so delighted to welcome my guest, Elizabeth Coplan. Elizabeth is a marketing and public relations specialist, a playwright, educator, and speaker who confronts end-of-life issues. In 2016, Elizabeth created the nonprofit Grief Dialogues, where she uses theater as the artistic expression to open new conversations about dying, death, and grief. Elizabeth is also the executive producer of the short award-winning film 8 a.m. by Mark Harvey Levine, and is the force behind Grief Dialogues, the book, Stories of Love and Loss. And you can learn a lot more about Elizabeth's work at the website griefdialogues.com. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Karen. It's my absolute pleasure.
Well, we had the opportunity to meet several weeks ago, and the idea came up that perhaps we could present something together around Mother's Day and motherless daughters and grief over Mother's Day. And I'm so grateful that you were able to make this recording for me so that we can broadcast it on Mother's Day. But before we get into our topic, I was hoping, Elizabeth, you'd just share a little bit of your story about how you first got interested in addressing end-of-life issues.
Well, actually, it's quite simple. Loved ones started to die, and no one was willing to talk to me about it. And so I took my grief and I started writing about it. In the case of my cousin who died of ovarian cancer, my sister and I were with her the last 2 weeks of her life. And I found that family members who were not in California at the time wanted to know what her last couple of days were like. So I wrote about that. And it was only through writing that people began to share their stories. So I shared my story, and then it seemed to open up that they shared theirs. And that was really just so invigorating. Truly, I'd share one story or one play, and people would come up to me and say, "Oh, that was a great story. It was a great play. That happened to myself and my brother or my sister or my mother." And then they'd launch into their own stories. And I realized right away that the important part of what I was doing was allowing them the opportunity to share their stories.
And that's so true. The power of story to open people up, I think, to really help people connect with their own emotions and their own stories. It is kind of contagious in a way.
It very much is. And you can tell with a grief story in particular that people have been waiting for this moment to be able to share that story. And it's a great physical relief to let it out. You can see it in their eyes. You can see it in their body posture. And it's very rewarding for me to know that I can help facilitate that beginning of a healing process. And a number of times that is literally the beginning of the healing process when someone can share their story, their grief story.
And it does seem true still today, what you experienced is that in general, people don't find that others want to hear their story. They may feel very shut down if they even try to tell someone the story. So to just create this open space and open-heartedness where you're welcoming people to share their stories is such a gift to them.
Absolutely. And there's no judgment because we're sharing. There's no judgment. I cannot tell you how many times people have said to me, "Oh, I thought I was the only one who felt like that when, my husband died," or "How did you know that my sister and I had those kinds of discussions? We were both in the room when our mother died, but we remember it very differently. And how did you know that?" Whereas there's a universal story, a universal grief appeal, if you will, that kind of weaves together all our stories that are unique to us, but are also based in commonality. And it's that commonality that, we hear this a lot right now, the commonality of we're all in this together. And that's very true about death and grief. We will all suffer some sort of loss between now and the day we die. That's a given. No one's exempt. It truly is the great equalizer. Grief is. And you can't have grief if you didn't love. Mm-hmm. That's my big motto. And so when people say that they're kind of ashamed of their grief, I will often turn to them and say, "Are you ashamed because you love that person?" And of course they say, "Well, of course not." And then don't be ashamed of your grief. Let it out. And don't let society make you ashamed of your grief.
And I really like what you were saying about hearing one another's stories, even in our own family, when we were participating in the same experience and different perspectives. And it reminds me of, in my own experience, my father died by suicide many, many years ago. But it took my mother and brother and I 20 years before we actually shared our stories with each other about what that experience was like for each one of us. I think the pain was so great, the guilt we each felt, and the shame again of what had happened and not even finding words or knowing how to talk about it. And yet, the day that we finally had this breakthrough and each one of us could tell our stories, it was amazing. It was so powerful and so healing. And of course, I've always wondered, why didn't that happen much earlier? But I guess it happens, when we're able to have that experience together.
When it feels comfortable. Although there's a lot to be said of sharing when it doesn't feel comfortable too. But I guess the time is right when you're finally able to speak about it. Then, comfortable or not, that's the time.
Yes, yes, definitely. Yeah, and in that case, I had shared the story. I was able to share the story with people outside of our family, but it was in that close family unit somehow that
Mhm.
it was just too tender for a long time.
Especially in the case of suicide, where there's more than enough guilt to go around. Um, it's hard to share the story when you feel guilty, and then the other person feels it's just compounded. But like you said, it was time.
Yes, definitely. Well, I wanted to ask you about creating grief dialogues, which I know you have a nonprofit organization, Grief Dialogues, and a book, Grief Dialogues, the book, and there's also a play, Grief Dialogues. So tell us all about that, about how you got inspired to create each one of those, or what led to those.
Well, I'd be more than happy to. So when my cousin, who I'd mentioned earlier, when she was dying of ovarian cancer down in California, I flew from Seattle. My sister flew from Miami to be with her and to make her comfortable during those times. And there was like I said, people didn't want to hear about it. And so I just kind of decided one day that I was going to write a play about it. And I was an actor way back in the day, and I just love theater. And I thought, rather than writing all the narrative and everything else that surrounds a novel or an essay, I just wanted to do the dialogue. And so I wrote this play about uh, uh, two sisters, and the day after their mother's death. I have a Broadway actor friend of mine who's originally written it about a cousin, and he says, change it to a mother, and it'll be a much better story. So I did, and anyway, it's a 2-woman show called Hospice: A Love Story, and friends of mine in the theater read it and encouraged me to enter it in contests. And so I thought, oh, what the heck? So I did, and I started winning some of them, and including one was at the Lonnie Chapman Theater in Los Angeles with the group Rep, and it played for 6 weeks that summer there, which was really an amazing experience for someone like me. Anyway, people afterwards, when they knew I was the playwright, they'd come up to me and they started sharing the stories, as I mentioned earlier. And I began to realize that if we had, it was a short play, a one-act play. If we had 5 or 6 short plays depicting various scenarios about dying, death, and grief, we would hit a large group of people in some form of another and their experiences. And so I have some playwright friends, and I was at the Dramatists Guild National Conference in San Diego that year. And so I was talking to them, and they said, oh, I have a play, or I've been working on a play that deals with dying, death, and grief. I'll send it to you. And these were great plays. They were really good. But I began to also realize that we had some significant holes. And so I did a call for submissions. I did not, with that particular request, I didn't want about suicide and I didn't want about child loss, only because I needed to narrow it. And to me, that was getting into a very specific frame of reference that I did not have. And I wasn't quite ready to take that on yet. But anyway, so we got about 400 submissions, and I narrowed it down. And then I have an advisory council, and they all took a very objective, or as objective as you can be about art, very objective look at all the plays that were submitted that I had kind of put in the semi-final category. I read them all and put aside about 40 of them. They then narrowed that down to 20, and then finally 14. And I hired a director, Wesley Fouget, and he and I sat down and picked out 6 that we wanted to open our very first Grief Dialogues, the play, with, which we did. That opened on September 9th, 2017 at the University of Washington, the Jones Playhouse. And it was the opening event for the Seattle Death Salon, which was done in conjunction with the UW School of Social Work and with the Order of the Good Death out of Los Angeles. And it was extremely well received. And from that, we went on to do a number of other plays. And in the process, I had a lot of stories being sent to me. And that's when I thought, you know what, we need to do a book as well. And actually, in the book, there are 3 short plays, including my piece, Hospice, a Love Story, in there for people to read as well. So my nonprofit was because I was feeling like I was doing a service. Every day my inbox had emails from people saying, oh my gosh, I saw your play, or I read this or that. And it just filled me with such joy to know that people really were responding to what we were offering. So we built the website. Well, we built a nonprofit. We raised money. We did shows all over the United States, from Pittsburgh to Portland to LA to Seattle and Los Angeles. Oh, I said LA. Anyway, so that was fantastic. And then I began to realize not too long ago, maybe a year ago, that it was great to go to the general public, but the people who really needed to feel these stories were our healthcare providers. Mm-hmm. And so just this year, 2020, I have taken Grief Dialogues, the nonprofit, and made I've pivoted to a new model, and it's called Grief Dialogues Healthcare Education. And so now the plays that we are writing are to be performed for healthcare providers and caregivers, for which they will receive continuing education credits. Our theory was that providers could then walk a mile in someone else's shoes. Sometimes seeing it enacted in front of them is kind of an aha moment. It's a, wow, I didn't know that the patient might be thinking that, or some other way to respond. And we're opening up this whole dialogue about compassion, which is what I felt when we do our book readings in various cities, is the compassion that you share with your own story that resonates with someone else. They feel that compassion. And so and the same goes with healthcare education and with physicians. And that has been really exciting. We did 5 shows in February, 1 in Los Angeles, 4 in the Seattle area, 1 with the Virginia Mason Hospital, 1 with the UW Medical Center and the School of Social Work, and Honoring Choices Pacific Northwest, which deals with advanced care planning. So it's been growing exponentially in the most beautiful, organic way. And every time I think, well, I'm going to stick just with healthcare education, then I get flooded with requests for stories or sent stories that just blow my socks off, that are like, I have to share this with other people. And so we definitely want to keep the whole Grief Dialogues sharing stories alive and well, and not just for healthcare providers. That's our other day job.
So can I ask you, if someone listening is part of an organization and feels like, wow, these plays would be perfect to bring to my event or to bring into my organization, is that something that they can
Absolutely
make arrangements for? Yeah,
absolutely. I actually, as I mentioned, we did several. In a couple of cases, we actually wrote original work for that organization. And so that, like for Honoring Choices, we did a play on advanced care planning, and it was an interactive play. So the audience got to choose their own adventure, if you will. And I have to admit, when I was first asked to do that by Honoring Choices, I was a little like, oh my gosh, I just write straight plays. But it turned out to be really fun, and the audience loved it and very, very much felt a part of it, and the actors loved it too. So absolutely, we have a library of plays, but we also can tailor them, and or we can be commissioned to write an original piece of work that is specific to that organization or that event.
Well, I think the timing is really perfect. Right now, we're in the midst still of the COVID-19 pandemic, and I hear stories every single day about the overwhelming grief that healthcare providers are experiencing. And I think in some cases, they're too busy to have time to process their own grief feelings, but also they just may not know how, because it's not something that we are taught in our training. It's not something that we've been helped with much in the past. And so it seems like these plays would be an excellent way to bring some of that healing into healthcare providers all over the country.
Right. And that's exactly what we are working towards doing now. And in fact, I have a podcast with a therapist who's now on our board, Peggy Dickens, talking about that very thing, about how therapists can help or be there for physicians who typically don't ask for help. They're stoic. They don't seek help. And therefore you have this high rate of physician burnout and even suicide. Mm-hmm. So helping them to understand that it's okay to ask for help, to see themselves in some of these plays, to kind of understand what a patient's family might be going through, that really, it helps everybody. And I'm a big one for, I think it's called the quadruple aim, where it's not only patient satisfaction, but it is physician satisfaction as well. And that's what our new way we're pivoting with healthcare education, is to really help train physicians in compassionate care, both for their patients and for themselves. And there's a study out, actually in a book called Compassionomics, that says, and this is actually results of several studies, it takes 40 seconds to convey to your patient that you care, that you are giving them compassionate care. 40 seconds, that's all.
Wow.
And so to see that demonstrated on stage is extremely powerful, because even the busiest doctors have 40 seconds.
Yes, that's such an amazing statistic. I mean, that's powerful in itself, because if you were to ask the average doctor, what would it require for you to show your patients compassion? Probably most of them would think, well, I don't have time for that. It would take so much time, I couldn't possibly do it. So it's really wonderful to have that information available.
Right. And we show how to do it in 40 seconds. And sometimes it doesn't even have to be 40 seconds. I read not too long ago about a doctor on the front lines who, with all the, protective gear, obviously the patients can't even see his eyes with all, expressions on his face. And so he put a picture of himself, a good sized picture on himself, on a badge that he wore. And so people could see that underneath all of that, there's a smiling doctor. And that is compassionate care. And how long did that take to do?
Yes.
You do it once, and now you've done it for your whole floor, or however many patients you're dealing with. And I think just sometimes it's not necessarily what they, like you said, not what you've learned to do, but it doesn't quite come across as an idea for you, because you're not, in this case, maybe not into arts and crafts. And this may sound a little more arts craftsy, but nonetheless, it's compassionate. And so that's what we do in these shows too, is we demonstrate how this looks, how it feels, and how it feels to the patient.
Mm. Wow, I love that. I just find this really exciting and something that's so needed right now. So I'm grateful that you're out there doing this and offering these plays. Um,
Absolutely.
and because today's Mother's Day, we had talked about focusing in also today on the grief of daughters whose mothers have died. And Mother's Day is a particularly difficult day, I think, for
Yes.
motherless
Mhm.
daughters to go through. And I always think about that the mother-daughter relationship is so special. For many of us, it's also can sometimes has conflict in it, and it's a push and pull kind of relationship. And yet it's so powerful for us. And losing our mothers, to lose the person that who carried us in her womb and who was the first person to hold us and love us, it's such a devastating experience. And
It,
so I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about your experience with that.
right. Well, my mother died 20 years ago, and we were very, very close. And in the end, actually, she was dealing with Parkinson's, and my father had died unexpectedly back in Texas where they lived at the time. And so it fell on me to bring her to Seattle uh, for the rest of her life, which was only 4 more years. Because the grandchildren were there, and she really did have a good last 4 years of her life. But I do remember that her last Mother's Day, I actually got annoyed because, as a mother myself, I wanted a day off, and I remember thinking, "Can't I just have a day off?" And of course, that guilt when she died was huge, and I have ever since 20 years now on Mother's Day, or on Mother's Day, at some point, I will start to cry and I will say, "I'm sorry I ever thought that, Mom," because what I wouldn't give to have her back. And yet, there are people who maybe weren't all that sad when their moms died. In my case, I wasn't, not because I didn't love her, but because she was suffering so much from Parkinson's. But there are others, they could be abusive. They could have had a really horrible relationship. But like you said, it's the first person who you've touched and who touched you in whatever form. But literally in the womb, just out of the womb, even if you're whisked away in adoption, this woman touched you, your birth mother. And it's just one of those things you cannot replace it with a father. It's not the same. I mean, I loved my father dearly and was very, very sad when he died. But a mother, like you said, giving birth, the act of giving birth, I think, makes a mother very, very special. I think very special to women, especially those who've gone on to be mothers themselves.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that this person is here because of you, the mother, or you're here because of your mother type thing. It's pretty powerful stuff.
Yes.
So I don't like to think of it as a have to day. I know my kids, I don't want them to think like, oh God, we got to do something nice for Mom. That's not it. I'll do something nice for me. Basically what I always said to the boys was, I just don't want to have to do anything. If you need your socket clothes clean, well, clean them. If you want something to eat and you can't cook, ask your dad. Those kinds of things. That's all I ever wanted. But it is a special day, and I think we all pause in some way to reflect on who our mother was, for good or bad or indifferent. It is a day to pause.
Yes, definitely. No matter what, she's the person that got us here, that got us onto this planet. So,
Exactly.
well, you and I have selected two stories from your book, Grief Dialogues. And so I'd love to have you share those stories with us. I wanted to just point out to our listeners that you're in Costa Rica, and we have an audience of some birds, it sounds like. And I am actually really enjoying it, but I just wanted the listeners to know what the sounds are that they might hear from time to time. I think I think they're trying to share their stories with us as well.
They're trying, and I also should tell you, there's a few howler monkeys out there too. So if you hear little things that sound like, miniature dinosaurs roaring, those are howler monkeys, and they have been talking to me all day.
Okay, wow. Well, you have the privilege of being in a very beautiful place right now, and so we all get to listen in as if we're sitting there with you. So that's really nice.
Oh, good. Come join me. I have to pinch myself. I have a little bit of what they call survivor's guilt being here, but it's a very safe, healthy place for me right now.
Yes, I'm glad to hear that. So would you go ahead and just start with the first story and introduce it, and then we could chat about that a little at the end?
Certainly. Okay. So the first story is I Am a Marionette by Megan Vered. And I'm going to apologize ahead of time. We are Jewish, but my Yiddish is not what it could be or should be. But Megan did coach me on a number of the phrasing, so I think I have it. But if you have any listeners out there going, that's not how you pronounce it, just please, it'll be, this is these Gentiles' way of pronouncing Yiddish. It's called, as I mentioned, I Am a Marionette by Megan Vered. Mom, I'm bored. Go play with your sister. She's boring. Go read a book. I already did. Then draw a picture. My crayons are broken. Geh schlag zack kap and wand. Literal translation, go bang your head against the wall. This is only one example of the Yiddish disciplinary tactics employed by my mother when we were kids. Yiddish was my mom's first language. She was not even exposed to English until she went to kindergarten. Yiddish was also the secret language that my grandparents reverted to when they did not want us to understand them. We caught on fast and learned to crack the code. We knew that give a cook meant take a look, that geh gesundheit meant go in good health, that Soros was suffering. And of course, my grandmother bathed us in Yiddish endearments that were well understood. Shena Madela, Shena Welt, Shena Mamala. Literal translations, beautiful maiden, beautiful world, beautiful little mother. I am bruised not just by my mother's death, but also by the passing of the Yiddish language and the first generation of American Jewish experience. Ancient voices spoke to me through my mother's flesh. Her presence kept me linked to her history and the heartbeat of those who came before her. Encircled by the reverberation of past experiences, I gained comfort and strength. Now that she is gone, precious ties have been severed. I am a marionette whose strings have been dropped. Not that Mom controlled my every move like some manic puppeteer, but her presence was a lifeline that kept me linked to those who came before. Without her, I feel rootless, lifeless. When I move my arm to gesture to a stranger or lift my leg to walk, there's nothing holding me in place. I am in free fall with no point of reference, no one to slip an arm through mine and keep me linked to tradition, ritual, or custom. Mom's Yiddish expressions, vibrant word salads, both entertained and annoyed. She held high expectations that I would rise to the occasion and be a good sport. When I complained about life being unfair, her stock response was, I never promised you a rose garden. When my grousing persisted, she said, I'll thank you to keep a civil tongue in your mouth, young lady. When I persevered with no end in sight, she switched to Yiddish. Geh hak mir nicht kan chinken. Literal translation, don't bang me a tea kettle, as in, stop nudging me. I can also hear her voice of derision when she would see something in a store that was just too kitschy. Ach, angepatscht ket, too fussy. The word verblangette was used when she was feeling at sixes and sevens or out of sorts. Literal translation, mixed up and lost. When we sneezed, a sehr gesund was bestowed to the first three sneezes. Literal translation, to your health. Sneeze number 4, however, invoked Ge undered du krikkes sheen goud. Into the earth with you already, you're getting a cold. When we did good, Mom would cavell. Literal translation, burst with pride. When we did her proud, she would shep nakas. Literal translation, derive pride and joy. When we were bad, she'd cry, "Geh weg." Literal translation, go away. Without the melody of my mother's song, my strength falters. No walls of wisdom to push up against so that I can rebound. I have lost all ricochet power. And without the strings that have kept me tethered to Mom's story, my life appears flat, one-dimensional. And on top of this, I regret dropping the ancestral ball, having never used Yiddish expressions with my own children, with the exception of the occasional oy vey. As we grew older and our children matured, Mom's Yiddishisms shifted to expressions of grandmotherly endearment. As malep dur lep mir, literal translation, if you live long enough, you will live to see it happen. And her favorite, Mashugana Gribben, literal translation, crazy geese, crazy gooselings. I'm a marionette whose strings have gone slack. I forget birthdays and punchlines and how our family first met certain friends. I lose track of bloodlines and which cousins are on which side of the family. I look at photographs and cannot decipher whether the girl next to me in the photo is an elementary school friend or my next door neighbor's sister. What will bring me back to life now that Mom is gone? Who will repeat the stories to me with such care and precision? An entire civilization is heaving its final inconsolable breath. I search through boxes of mementos for reassurance that I will not lose sight of my familial footprint. In among the greeting cards and photographs, I find lined paper folded in thirds, a 4-page summary of her lineage, her first-generation American Jewish experience in her perfectly appointed handwriting. I take a deep breath and say thank you. I dream one night after Mom's death that she is crying. She tells me that she is feeling undone. You mean verblunget, Mom. I tell her that I am a marionette who has lost strings. We make a fine pair, I say. For weeks, I sob myself into a stupor before sleep. Each wave of tears evokes another level of loss. Who would ever love me the way my mother did? Who would hold my strings with such tenacity? Who would cavil over my every triumph, no matter how small? She knew every soppy detail of my life story, the name of every boy I ever loved, every girl who turned against me. She was the one who soothed me through the endless fallings out and reproachments with my younger sister. Who else would ever be so enchanted by the tiny particles of my life? And who else but my mother would tell me to bang my head against the wall?
Oh, I love that. Oh, it's just such a beautiful story, and it just evokes so much in me. I love the image of being a marionette whose strings have come loose. And I resonate with that feeling so much. And also just the idea of how much of our heritage we lose when our mothers die, all the stories that go with them. And at least I feel of myself that I was so careless with those stories she always wanted to tell me, so careless in my listening and my remembering. And I regret that now. I'd give anything for her to sit with her and just listen and let her tell me the same stories over and over again.
Right. I had the same feeling. By the time I actually had some breathing space to ask my mother more questions, she could no longer talk due to the Parkinson's. And so life kind of took a cruel twist there. I do have a lot of personal possessions that I know come from a grander time, pre-depression. And I've heard the stories of a lot of the china, the silverware, whatever. And what saddens me is, where will they go when I'm gone?
Mm-hmm.
Because my mom, my dad died when my boys were very small, the only grandchildren, and there's no one really to pass on the stories to, and that makes me especially sad. So I agree, there's lost opportunities that we had, and then if we lost them too soon, there's lost opportunities that our children had. So yeah, this is the time of year when I dust off the family china and get a little teary-eyed.
Yeah. Oh, so sweet. And the line that no one will ever love me like my mother, or what was it about the little
that no one would ever be so enchanted by the tiny particles of my life.
Oh, that's just beautiful.
That line. And I do remember myself, because I graduated from high school when I was 16 and moved to New York City and so forth. So I didn't live back at home except for 1 year when I was finishing college, when we did go back to college. And I've always lived elsewhere. My parents were in Texas. I've always lived in New York or LA or Seattle, but I always called home. And I just always loved how they literally wanted to know every single thing I did since the last phone call. My father, especially, he always wanted to know what I had to eat. Not my eating or not eating, but especially when I lived in like New York and LA and we're trying new foods all the time. We're going out for ethnic, but he wanted to know what they were and what it was like and what was in them. And my mom wanted to know every person I met and who I ran into. And it was just, they would be on the phone for hours just questioning me, just having these little tiny questions in my life. And I remember there's long distance, and usually I'd call them and I was like, I'm living in New York City, but that doesn't mean I have a New York City salary, but I pay for these phone calls and how much it costs them. But again, God, I would pay triple that to have one of those conversations again. So
yes.
Yeah, it's pretty special.
Yes, definitely. I was reminded of an image of when I was in grade school making a necklace. We always made some kind of gift for our mothers for Mother's Day, making a necklace out of macaroni that had been dyed different colors, and stringing it on a piece of yarn. And I remember that my mother wore that necklace to church on Mother's Day, and it was a long time before I realized, wow, she actually did that. And I thought, would I wear a macaroni necklace to church? I mean, I just realized the amount of love that she felt, and she actually was enchanted. It actually was a beautiful, wonderful gift in her eyes. And yeah, no one else would wear a macaroni necklace for me.
No. Another story. Are we ready to move on? Yes. Okay. And I do want to say for for your listeners, I know I said we're Jewish, and then I said I was, my pronunciation was from a Gentile. I was raised Catholic. My husband is Jewish, and we raised our boys Jewish, and they have been bar mitzvahed and living in New York and so forth. I'm actually the Jewish person in the family, because I've had the most experience. So just to clarify that, if some of your listeners are going, well, wait a minute, I thought she said. But this other one is, it's called Grief is Like Swimming in the Middle of the Ocean, and I hate the ocean. It's by a friend of mine, Alica Forneret, and she is actually hosting the Motherless Mother's Day on the Reimagine End of Life virtual, virtual performances and presentations and so forth. And if it's going on for 2 months. It's not just motherless. It's not just motherless women's stories. It's all kinds of end of life stories, and some of it's grief, but some is virtual funeral practices and making art out of grief, etc. And I highly recommend it. And you can go to letsreimagine.org, and there's 2 months full of online and mostly free programming. And I think some of your listeners will really be interested in some of the beautiful things that are being shared there.
Yes.
And I mention that because Alicia's got several shows that she's doing on that. And I'm glad that I'm getting a chance to read her piece, because on one of the shows, she's asked me to bring a few authors to read, which we will do. But I really wanted her to read her piece. And she said no, that she wanted the other authors to have an opportunity. So I'm honored now to read this on behalf of Alicia. Grief is like swimming in the middle of the ocean, and I hate the ocean. Grieving can often feel like you're drowning, like you were suddenly plucked off land, out of your normal everyday life, and dropped headfirst into the deep blue sea. When you realize where you are and you start swimming, it can be overwhelming to get acclimated. You get tired really fast, because what the F, you've never had to swim this much before. You get stressed, because why the hell did this just happen to you? You get irritated, because where is everybody else dealing with this shit? And you get to swim, because in our society, life doesn't stop just because your mothers did. Whether you're out there floating around on the sunny days or the stormy ones, grief is always there, surrounding you. Maybe you've climbed on top of a log, feeling the warmth of the sun for the first time in months. You're only waist deep, letting your legs hang supported and stable. Or maybe your eyebrow deep, wondering if you'll ever come up for air, with your arms and life and the world and socializing, feeling so heavy that you just can't swim right now. Randomly, over days, weeks, months, years, you're dragged to the bottom of the ocean by a scary squid that's wrapped you up in its tentacles and won't let you up for air. Someone in your life says, "Aren't you okay yet? It has been a year." Or your best friend who stops talking to you because you cry too much, and they just don't know how to help. And even when it's not those overwhelmingly scary, horrendous things making it hard to stay above water, you're constantly being nipped on the toes by annoying little fish, a photo you find in the drawer, or you're being pooped on by a seagull, or that dumbass that says, "Don't forget to wish your mom happy Mother's Day this weekend," when she's dead. Or you're passed by a boat that is just out of range to hear you scream for help. Or an ill-attentioned but totally ignorant dummy that flips you off in traffic on the anniversary of your best friend's suicide. Some days bringing a little relief, though. A log floats by for you to grab onto. You find a side hustle or dedicate more time to playing with your kids or your book in a weekend getaway. The sun peeks out from behind a cloud. A postcard arrives in the mail, or a distant relative shoots you a heart emoji. Or a super cute seal swims by and brightens your days. See? Why, I try to pet every puppy I pass on the street. Unfortunately, you can always see some waves and clouds looming in the distance. Holidays, anniversaries, death, babies, weddings, funerals, the list goes on. And brace yourself constantly for them to hit. They seem never ending, always on the horizon, and the first laps of wave water or the first drops of rain signal the unavoidable pain that's about to turn into hard days or weeks of fighting the elements. People pretend like you'll find an island one day, or like there's a way you'll suddenly grow wings and fly out of the water. This is about as likely as controlling when you'll cry a year after someone dies. They pretend like you're not in the middle of the ocean, but voluntarily going swimming with the option of getting out to sunbathe on a warm, dry beach. Like you can climb out of these seemingly shallow waves whenever you need to go to work, whenever you need to celebrate someone else's happiness, or whenever you need to pull it together for whatever the hell reason there could possibly be to get over your loss. And that misconception, The misunderstanding that grief doesn't envelope and surround us constantly from the moment we lose someone, and sometimes even before we lose them, is what you start to fight. Instead of getting out of the water at that non-existent beach, your arms and legs just get stronger. Your brain stops obsessing about when a raft is going to drift by. You do what you can to protect yourself against absurd beliefs and misinformed help. Thankfully, every once in a while, a badass, glittery Lisa Frank dolphin comes along and lets you grab onto her fin for a break from swimming. A friend that shows up out of the blue with Chinese food, 4 boxes of tissues, and a whatever you need attitude. A coworker who puts their arm on your shoulder decades after your mom has passed and offers to let you cry on their shoulder on a Tuesday. Or anyone that lets you be you for a moment or a day or a year. Sad or happy, just trying to ride the waves without drowning.
That imagery is so powerful as well. I think especially right now, as everyone's going through this COVID-19 pandemic, I think a lot of people feel as though they're swimming in the ocean and wondering when they'll ever get out of that.
Right. And that's the thing too, that I'm seeing people who are grieving, our rituals of funerals or memorials or gatherings when someone has died is so, so important, that sense of connection. And now to lose someone you love and not have that sense of connection because of COVID-19, whether that person died from the disease or something else, it's just, I think this is going to set us back a long ways in mental health issues if we don't realize how this affects people. Mm-hmm. And if we continue to do this, kind of pushing people away, saying, oh, you'll get over it, or it's been a year. Let's just say we got to stop that because it's going to be different. And getting over it never was a good idea to say. And now it's even worse idea to say because there are so many complexities now laid upon our grief that weren't even there before COVID, but are there now, that I do worry about, our mental health in the time of grief in COVID, which is another reason why I've come back to the stories for people to share, because I think it's going to be more important than ever to share these stories and encourage others to write their own. And I always say, write your own journal, whatever. You don't have to share it with anybody. It's a way to heal. If you do want to share it and let other people know that maybe they're not alone, then by all means, let's do it. I want to make that happen. But it's also okay just to write it for yourself.
And I think it's a time when we need to use our stories and writing and creativity, since we may not have some of the rituals we've counted on in the past. They might not be there for us or be possible right now. I think using creativity in other forms could be so helpful and so healing for everyone who is grieving right now.
Absolutely. And our motto at Grief Dialogues is out of grief comes art. Because whether it's a play or a book or a painting or a cheesecake, a lot of works of art come out when you are using some sort of art form to process your grief, to heal through grief, to understand your grief. Some pretty amazing works of art come out of that. And that's another reason why we like to share on Grief Dialogues.
Yes, and I think when you're in the midst of that process, sharing your own story and then hearing other people's stories at the same time, I think that's also a powerful connection.
Very powerful, yes.
When we start to see that we're not the only one in the middle of the ocean feeling like we're being pulled down to the bottom.
Right. Yes, there's a lot of us out there in the ocean, and if we can join hands. That, we may not survive, but we'll be together.
Yeah. Wow. Well, so I just wanted to mention that both of these stories are in the book, Grief Dialogues, the book, Stories of Love and Loss. And where can people get the book if they'd like to purchase it?
Right. Well, they can get it through their independent bookstore. If the bookstore doesn't have it, they can order it. It's through Ingram Publishing. They can also order it on Amazon. There's a Kindle version. And if they make a $25 tax-free or tax-deductible, I should say, donation on the Grief Dialogues website, we will send the book for free. So there's 3 ways to find it there.
So that website, griefdialogues.com, is an important URL for people to remember, because you can go there to make a donation and get the book. Also, if you'd like to submit a story, is that where they would submit it through the website?
That's where they go as well, right. They would go to the website. In the upper right-hand corner, it says submit a story, and they can send it that way. And by the way, I've gotten, especially lately, a lot of wonderful poetry. So, and I've gotten some photographs. So really, it's all types of art forms.
And the website's a great place to go browse. I was on there before we started recording, reading some of the stories that have been posted there, some of the COVID-19 stories that are just amazing.
Mm-hmm. They really are. And I was preparing for today for your podcast, Karen, and then for one I'm doing tomorrow. And so I haven't set the editorial calendar yet for the rest of May, but I have quite a few new stories relating to COVID. And one I hope to post on Mother's Day actually is from a trucker whose mother actually died 10 years ago. But now driving down these highways where there's absolutely no one else on the highway, he thought about her for the first time in a very long time, and how this Mother's Day will be very poignant for him, probably the hardest one in the 10 years since she's been gone. And it's all because he's actually had time to think, driving out on the open road with no one there. And it's an amazing story that he shares. So yes, and that one just came in a couple of weeks ago. So please, people, you want to share your stories? Or I've had some people saying, I don't know. In fact, I got a great poem. It kind of broke my heart because she ultimately decided she didn't want to have it published. But it's a brilliant poem, and I understand that too. If you can have it published anonymously or not publish it, just share it with me. I'm more than happy to read those as well.
Well, such a wonderful service. And I think for people at home right now dealing with grief, separated from, as we said, those rituals that could be helpful, I think take advantage of writing your story down, and don't worry, don't feel like you have to be a skilled writer. Just start writing and tell the story as if you were talking to someone.
Exactly.
And so let's see, is there anything else that we should mention here? You talked about letsreimagine.org, and I'll post that link on the show notes for this episode.
Right. And I also, if a lot of your listeners are thinking, are motherless, and that's a particularly difficult time for them now with Mother's Day and so forth, I recommend anything by Hope Edelman. She wrote the book Motherless Daughters, and I know she's got a Reimagine program coming up, but that's another wonderful resource. And it's Hope, Hope, and Edelman is Edelman, and it's hopeedelman.com, I believe. And if people are looking for resources with loss of their mother, she's an excellent resource.
Well, perfect. I'll share that link also. Thank you for letting us know about that. And I'll have to see if I can connect with Hope sometime and
absolutely
invite her on the podcast too.
Yes.
Well, I've been speaking with Elizabeth Coplan of griefdialogues.com, and this has just been wonderful. Thank you so much. What a great way to spend part of Mother's Day, Elizabeth, and hearing you read those 2 beautiful stories.
Well, thank you, Karen. This was a delight for me, and I love being able to share all these stories, not just mine, but everyone's. And it fills me with wonderful hope and love, because these stories are all written with hope and love. They may not always be happy, but they're hopeful. And especially during this time, I think we could all use a big dose of hope.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, well, thanks for joining with me to help celebrate a motherless Mother's Day,
Thank
Elizabeth.
you, Karen. This has been just a delight for me as well.
Yes, and hopefully we'll get to meet in person someday.
Absolutely. You better. I look forward to it.
Me too. All right. Goodbye.
Okay. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Elizabeth Coplan and the sharing of those two beautiful stories from her book, Grief Dialogues, the book Stories of Love and Loss. I loved both of those stories. Both of them touched me, as I revealed during our interview together. And it brought back a lot of memories of my relationship with my own mother, which was often tense for most of our lives together as mother-daughter, often filled with a lot of conflict. And I remembered once writing a story to my mom about why she was the perfect mother for me. And I remembered that I resisted the idea of praising my mom too much as a mother, because I still felt a lot of anger and resentment toward her. But at some point, I realized that her being exactly who she was, with all of her qualities and characteristics, made her the perfect mother for me, to help me become who I am. And all of those areas where we chafed against one another, all the rough edges, all the things about her that caused pain in me, were actually really important, because they gave me wounds from which I needed to heal and learn and grow and recover. And it was in the process of healing those wounds that I actually started to become my truest and best self. And so at some point, I began to feel grateful for her for being exactly who she was as a person, and grateful for all of the things about her that I would have said before were frustrating or annoying or painful or even downright heartbreaking to me. So, for the journal prompt today on Mother's Day, I think it's a good time for all of us to reflect back on our own mothers. And I know many people have a deep love for their mothers and don't ever talk about feeling conflict with their mothers, which is fine and wonderful and beautiful. But I think it's a good exercise for all of us to write a little bit about why my mother has been the perfect mother for me, and all of the ways in which our mothers have perhaps challenged us or encouraged us or inspired us to grow, and the characteristics of our own mothers that have actually made them the perfect mothers for this Mother's Day. So once again, happy Mother's Day to everyone out there, to all of you motherless daughters. May you find some comfort and peace today. May you reflect on your own mom today and feel gratitude and love for that relationship. Remember that there'll be a new episode every Monday, usually, except today was one day early. Also, on Fridays, I'm posting Love Over Fear stories for precarious times. I did notice that one of the stories is missing on the iTunes podcast app. I'm not sure why it doesn't appear there. You can always go to EOLUpodcast.com and scroll through all of the posts you'll find there, and you can listen to that story right on the web page if it doesn't appear on your app. I'm not sure why it didn't show up. I don't know how to figure that out either, but I wanted to let you know about those stories. And then also May 9th, I recorded another vigil for those who are grieving. And so the 9th day of each month, I'll be recording vigils for us to observe together, just brief little vigils, but a way of honoring the suffering and the pain that's taking place across our world right now. If you enjoy this content, please share it with others who might also benefit from listening in. And if you're so inclined, go to iTunes if you listen there and leave a review for the podcast. That really helps us to be ranked higher and therefore shown to more people who are looking for content like this. So thank you once again for being my loyal listeners. I'm very grateful for you today. And until we're together again next week, remember, we're here for love. So face your fear, be ready for whatever comes our way next, and love each and every moment of this fleeting life. Bye-bye.